Today, we will be talking about the far-right extremism, looking into what it is and what we could do about it on, national, community, and hopefully individual levels. And to help me address this issue, I give a very warm welcome to Mr. Jeff Schoep, the founder of Beyond Barriers, a US-based nonprofit organization dedicated to, as their webpage says, a world devoid of extremism, radicalized organizations, hate, violence, coercive and violent ideologies. Welcome, Jeff, and thank you very much for being with us.
It's an honor to be here, Mariam. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So my goal with these talks is always to put the spotlight on the speakers and to allow them to share their knowledge or, share their expertise. And I tend to think of myself more as a moderator rather than an interviewer. And today I think I'll be doing just that. I will be trying to keep my involvement to a bare minimum, just trying to moderate this conversation because I truly want people to have this opportunity to listen to what Jeff has to say. I will introduce the topic and the speaker very briefly. After that, we will engage in a conversation, and then I always do, I encourage audience questions. Whether you are a sort of a permanent member of our audience, or if you're joining us for the first time, you're very welcome to ask questions. Towards the end of the conversation, I will be asking my team to send me those questions, and then I'll try to ask Jeff as many of your questions as possible. So normally I pick the topics for these conversations based on their academic value. I mean, yes, in a sense. I think I try to think of what would be interesting to a young student who may be interested in researching or working around these topics. So we've talked about the formation of extremist ideologies, terrorist recruitment. We've talked about how sectarianism may be used and exploited by extremist organizations in the Middle East to their benefit, and other topics. But today's talk, I have to say, is somewhat different in that I was going to have a talk about the far right at some point, obviously, but it is no coincidence that we're talking about it today. For years now, as some of you may know, we've been talking about and we've been hearing that the far right extremism is on the rise, and there are plenty of manifestations of it from across the world. However, since, like I said, I mostly had the Georgian audience in mind, I did make this decision in the aftermath of what happened in the capital of Georgia on July 5th and 6th, which, for those of you who don't know, this is when the violent mobs wreaked havoc in Tbilisi in a violent attempt to prevent the gay pride from taking place on the main avenue of the capital. Hours before the march, they assaulted 53 journalists, destroyed private property, stormed the offices of Tbilisi Pride and Shame Movement, whilst openly encouraged by certain representatives of the Orthodox Church and the leaders of the ultra-conservative groups. Political leaders on all ends of the political sort of spectrum that we have here condemned the violence in general terms, some more reluctantly than others. But somehow the intended target of the violence, meaning the LGBTQI plus community of Georgia, disappeared from the discourse as it was pushed out by the mutual accusations by the opposition and the government regarding who was more to blame for what had happened. Another thing that is missing in the reflection about these events and their perpetrators is that the violence was ideologically motivated. The LGBTQI plus community epitomizes Western liberalism for the ultra-conservative groups here. The assault was mainly on liberal values as symbolized by the twice removal and consequent burning of the EU flag from in front of the parliament building. The first removal of the EU flag was followed by the erection of a cross in front of what is meant to be the symbol and the place where Georgia's secular democratic government takes place. This is to say that what happened was very far from violence for the sake of violence. It was a calculated act aimed at establishing dominance. These groups are normally thought of under the sort of general umbrella of the far right extremism. And here, at least, they're often referred to as either far right, ultra nationalist, ultra conservative, or anti liberal. Generally speaking, the far right has many different, it comes in many different forms and it has many different sort of ideological undercurrents. And with that said, I believe that our speaker today is best positioned to help us make sense of the far right with its many faces and give us his view of what societies can do in the face of this problem, both in terms of preventing this kind of violence and in terms of pulling people out of extremist milieus. The reason I say this, and this is the part where I introduce the speaker, the reason I say this is because Jeff himself is a former leader of the National Socialist Movement, which is America's largest neo-Nazi organization. He joined the movement at the age of 18, and by 21, he became the group's commander. Jeff led the organization from 1994 until early 2019. And in that time, the NSM is set to have grown to 61 chapters in 35 states. This is according to Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a legal advocacy group. To date, Jeff is the highest profile former white nationalist to ever walk away from the far right extremism in the US. But like I said earlier, today Jeff's work is dedicated to helping other people find a way out of extremism. With that said, once again, Jeff, thank you very, very much for being with us today. And if we could jump right into the conversation, my first question to you would be to help us maybe define or contextualize far right extremism, what it is, its many faces and different forms and ideological undercurrents that it comes in. The floor is yours, Jeff.
Thank you. Well, the far right, it encapsulates so many different different aspects as far as you can't label it and put it inside one box and say this is all far right, because there's so many different avenues of it. I mean, you have religious extremism of certain types, like Christian identity, which fall under this category. You have neo-Nazis that fall under this category, Ku Klux Klan, anti-homosexual activists, all different sorts of avenues that fall under this umbrella, so to speak. A lot of times we talk about the organization that I had been a part of, National Socialist Movement. A lot of times in that organization, people would say it's not right wing. It was, what I would say when I was there was that it took elements of the left and the right and combined it into this organization. So even when some people will say, I know a lot of conservatives will say, well, we don't want to be lumped in with the Nazis because they're actually leftists, because a lot of the social policies are more left-leaning in these type of organizations. So it's very complex. But to simplify it in that sense, when we look at far-right ideologies and some of the different things that they're doing, is and I want to differentiate. There's a big difference between being on the right and being on the left and being an extremist. You can be right-leaning, you can be left-leaning and not be an extremist. It's once you take that jump and you end up in the extreme category, that's when it becomes a problem. And why I say it's a problem is because how it affects other people within the nation. It affects people here in America, it affects people in Georgia, it affects people all over the world in that sense. Because when you get down to it, a lot of the far right ideology has to do with division. It has to do with dehumanizing the other. A lot of times it's referred to as othering, where you are dehumanizing your opposition, anyone that's against you. And a lot of times that's divided along racial lines. Sometimes it's divided along political lines. I can say from my own personal experience being in the National Socialist Movement, anyone that wasn't in that movement, even other right-wing organizations, quite often were considered the enemy because they didn't think exactly like we did. So it's a lot like being in an echo chamber or a bubble. And that's the concept of beyond barriers, and is basically that you've set up these barriers in your mind. You've erected them and you're stuck behind them. You can't see beyond that. You can't see beyond your echo chamber, your bubble. You're not able to see the humanity in the other. You're not able to see that. So what you've done in that sense is you've created an environment of dehumanization where you are dehumanizing other people. And you're not even able to see it. So you have this idea in your head that you're doing something noble, you're doing something productive, you're doing something honorable, you're going to And I'll use myself as an example of that. I truly believed that I was doing something noble and honorable, that I was going to save my country, that I was going to save my race from being exterminated, that I was going to do all these wonderful things. It wasn't until later that I realized I'm not doing a good thing here. I'm not saving my country. In fact, I'm dividing my country. I'm breaking the divisions down into the country along racial lines, along religious lines, along party lines, political lines. And I think that's an important topic that we need that the public to understand is a lot of times, and people across the landscape do this, where they'll say, I just had someone say it to me the other day. They said, I don't know how a Nazi, a former Nazi, had any empathy or had any type of feelings. You know, they get this idea in their head that these people that are involved in this are evil, that there's something wrong with them and things like that. And what I'd like to explain about that is, of course, you have that element. You're going to have people in there that are psychopaths and sociopaths, people that are filled with hate and things like that. But a lot of anyone is susceptible to being recruited into these type of movements, and that's really what I want to explain a little bit, is that sometimes when we have these talks and the public is there, there's people that they shut down. They'll say, no one in my family would ever join one of those movements. No one in my family would do that. So I don't know why I'm here at this talk, because no one would ever do that in my family. I come from a normal family, a middle class, working class family, a good family that wouldn't, that never supported what I did. And were, it was not something that they believed in. Um, so I want to explain that anybody can be recruited into these types of movements. Anyone can be susceptible to it. The whole idea of never in my family, I want to tell you, your child could be next. Your brother, your mother, your sister could be next. Anyone can be recruited into these movements. So, that whole line of never in my family, don't be so quick to jump there if you're one of those individuals. So, and I think I went a little over on your question there, kind of expanded on a bunch of things, but those are all important things I wanted to point out, Mariam.
No, they truly are very important, points that you mentioned. And in fact, this I think leads me perfectly into my next question, because you mentioned that there are, in a way, you talked about how there are many different sort of pathways into extremism, and no one is really saved, from that. You can't realistically sort of expect that this will never happen to you. Of course, there are some defensive mechanisms, and a multitude of both internal and external factors would have to come into play for a person to be, embark on the radicalizing journey. But I mean, the general idea is that it really can happen to a wide variety of people, and it does happen to a wide variety of people. So, having established that there are different pathways into extremism, I was wondering if you would be open to sharing your story of how you became engaged in the movement at the age of 18. Was I right in claiming that?
Yes, well, that's when I joined, but I had
Yeah.
been fascinated by it for a very long time before that.
Mhm.
My story is a little bit more unique, I think, for the United States, in that sense, where um, my grandfather had fought in the Third Reich in the German army, and my great uncles did as well. So my mother and her side of the family came over from Germany. So I'm first generation here in America. Um, Now, I want to preface this by saying no one in my family uh, pushed neo-Nazism or Nazism, I should say, onto me. In fact, they tried to actively discourage it, but I had this fascination with it from a very, very young age. And as young as elementary school, I was fascinated by it and reading history books on it and things like that. So for me, it was the historical aspect that I feel like led me down that trajectory, and maybe the historical family connection. But as I said, it was highly discouraged, and I wasn't I wasn't listening. They weren't getting through to me. And for years they tried to reach me, and it didn't work. So for me, that trajectory in was a little different because I had that historical interest. I'm still interested in history. I was just on the wrong path in history there.
Yeah.
Um, Falling into that. So by the time I got to 18, I joined the movement. I was looking
Mm.
for the closest movement to Hitler's movement in the United States. So the National Socialist movement was a continuation of the movement of George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder of the American Nazi Party. So this was the organization that I felt was closest to the German movement. That was the, I'd looked at different organizations. Met with skinhead groups. I met with um, a bunch of different groups, Klan, Nationalist Party organization, a number of different organizations. But that's the trajectory that led me. And for other people, there's people that joined that were over those years, and I'll get back to my own story, but just a little side note. There's people that all it takes is one issue to get them in the
Yeah.
door, where we had people that were joining that were saying, I never thought in a million years that I would be writing or emailing or calling the Nazis, but you guys are the only ones, in my opinion, in their opinion, that were standing up to illegal immigration, or whether it was our stance against homosexuality, or whatever that one issue was. Sometimes all it was that one issue. If you could get them in the door, then we felt like we had them. That at that point, the propaganda would bring them in. But back to my own story. So I got involved at 18 officially, and spent a lot of years, a lot of years involved in that. And um, as far as your question, was it how I got out after that, or did you want to hear more about the?
Well, if you could share a little bit about your time in the organization, because it is fascinating how within the span of, what is it, 3 years, you became the leader of the organization, and then you grew it to, I just said, I think 35 states. Was it 61 or 65 units in 35 states?
Yeah, that
It's
seems
quite a
accurate.
number.
Yeah, it became when I joined the National Socialist Movement, it was pretty small at that time. The organization started in 73 or 74,
Yeah.
which was way before my time. Um, and it had it was started by men that had served with Commander George Lincoln Rockwell. So it's a direct descendant of Rockwell's organization. So that's what I
Mm.
wanted to get involved in. I rose up in the ranks from a young age. I was highly active. I was a good recruiter. I was speaking. I was bringing people into the organization, and I was appointed as a local unit leader. And at that point, the organization was in maybe it was based in Minnesota at that time, where I'm originally from. And there was
Mhm.
a handful of people there, and then there was people in maybe a couple other two other states at the most when I first got involved. And after, within those first few years, the leader of the organization at that time had said he was stepping down, he was retiring. And I just remember thinking, oh no, this is at the time, I put myself back at that time period. I was thinking, this is terrible. What's going to happen with the organization? And he's appointed me to run the organization. So I was thinking, oh, this is really bad now. This was not something I didn't aspire to be the leader of the organization. That wasn't something that I wanted to do or anything like that. A lot of people aspire to be in these positions. It wasn't something that I wanted to do. It was sort of I reluctantly took on that duty, and from there, we grew the organization across the country, started engaging in all kinds of different things. In the early years, back in the 90s, you had leafleting, demonstrations, things like that. As it was getting closer to the 2000s, we were I don't remember the exact year. It was in the 90s, though. We were one of the earlier organizations to get on the internet, and have a
Mm.
website, and then develop things from there, forum boards, message boards. Um, Later on, we started a record label later in the 2000s, after
Yeah, I
the
remember
2000s.
reading about that.
Yes, and video games, podcasting, radio shows, the demonstrations still, obviously, everything that you could imagine, the organization was involved in. So getting that trajectory and propagandizing and getting out into the public was something that the NSM became very, very good at. So um, it wasn't something that I wanted to necessarily do, but I felt this sense of duty, of responsibility.
Mm,
Being in these movements, a lot of people, I guess the best way to explain this is you feel like you're on a mission. um,
right.
and I want to explain this too. It's coming from a good place. It's not good, but it's coming from a good place. When you join, most people, not everybody, but most people, when they're joining these movements, they believe, and I know I said this a little bit earlier, but I want to reiterate it. They believe they're doing something noble, something honorable.
Hmm.
Nobody joins this stuff and says, you know what? No one wakes up one day and says, you know what? I'm going to be the bad guy. I'm going to be somebody that's horrible, that's holding other people back, and that's what I'm going to do. Nobody does. If you're one of those people, you might be a sociopath. You might have some psychological issues. But the average person that joins these movements, they truly believe they're doing something good.
Yeah.
And that's how when we'll talk about it. I'm sure it's within the questions about how to disengage from this stuff, but
Yeah.
that leads into that, is when you have to understand the real reason why people get involved in this. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, I was just full of hate, talking about themselves, that they were full of hate and that's why they joined. Hate's developed there. Hate is fostered in these movements.
Mm,
It's part of it. It's definitely part of it, but it is not typically the motivating factor of why someone joins. If And there was those people over the years that
yeah.
had come in, and typically they made me nervous because if someone was motivated to join a cause by hate, they're potentially dangerous. And those are some of the people that you see that have gone and done some of these mosque shootings, synagogue shootings, and I won't name them because they don't deserve to be named.
Yeah.
Um, but those are the type of people that do those things.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there. It's just that I think a couple of things that you mentioned there led me to one additional question. Um, so one thing is that all of those things that you just mentioned, the record label, the gaming industry, all of that points and sort of is indicative of the fact that you clearly had, and well, I mean, still have a very good understanding of how important the communication is and how to expand, like, I suppose, like strategic communications, the type of communication that helps you achieve your goal and sort of cause the behavioral change in people. And then you mentioned the belief that prevalent in the people who join these movements is the belief that they're doing something good, that they're serving the noble cause. And I think this applies to people who engage in extremist activities across all ideological spectrums. It doesn't matter if we're talking about someone joining the white supremacist organization or movement, or if we're talking about someone who's joined ISIS, for instance. More often than not, the common thing, the common denominator that they all have is that belief that they are indeed serving something like a higher, better purpose. So, and that hatred is fostered, and it's not necessarily the sort of the entry point for everyone. So with this introduction, I was wondering, you also mentioned that you used to do recruitment. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, aside from the fact that you would use all those communication mediums to presumably to reach the audience as wide as possible, I'm assuming the movement also, the organization also did sort of face-to-face recruitment. Could you talk about a little bit about that? Like, what kind of, was there a type of people that you would target, that the organization would target, or was it more like the more the merrier? I hate what I just said, but I mean, was it more like the more people we manage to attract, the better it is, or was there some sort of a type that the organization would go after?
That's a really good question. And this is going to have two answers, because with the NSM, it was the organization I was a part of. the idea was to recruit from all aspects of society. So there
Mm-hmm.
was, and sometimes when we did, because I'd done interviews with news media from overseas and from all over the country and things like that. And one thing especially that was common from some of the reporters and things in Europe would ask me, they said, the NSM to us is very interesting because it has, we would always post pictures, because when you're on the internet, you can have an organization that has like the best website. And I have an example of this, but I'm not going to name the group, but there was an organization that had this website early on, and it was the best. I mean, the highest quality, the best website you could imagine. It was an organization with like one person, one or two or three
Oh.
people. It was very small. And they projected this image that they were this big organization. And that's a propaganda tactic, of course. But with the NSM, one of the things that I wanted to show was that this was more than propaganda, that we would post pictures of our activities, of videos, things like that, to show that, hey, look, you're joining this organization, you're not being fooled by a one-man show here. This is a large organization, it's national and all that. But what I was going back to saying on the with the foreign media, they said what's interesting to us is that there's young people and there's middle-aged people and everything in between, elderly people. Usually in different organizations, you see kind of this, like in a skinhead movement, it's mostly guys in their 20s and 30s.
Young people, yeah.
Young people. Whereas some of the more conservative, more established organizations are going to be middle-aged or older people. And they said, what's interesting is you have all of those and you have skinheads and these type of people too in the organization. And that was a little bit, women in leadership positions, which was something that was not typical in the far right, in the NSM. So this organization that I was a part of is a little, has some big differences than some of the other ones, where a lot of other ones will concentrate on specific subsets of society, like, blue collar and working class. The one element that we didn't look at recruiting typically was your rich and your upper class, because we felt that they weren't interested in our working class message. So it's not that we didn't want them. We didn't have that kind of, we could have used that funding or whatever that they had, but they just weren't interested in the message, we felt like. But aside from the rich, we felt like the middle class, early on, it was all blue collar, working class, and poor that were in the organization. In later years, especially when the economy started taking a hit, we were seeing a lot more middle class people coming into the organization, which I thought was pretty interesting at the time, because typically it was your working class, your blue collar, your poor that were involved. Later on, it became a lot more middle class people. So I wouldn't say that there was necessarily a targeted demographic other than white people.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. For some reason, I'm thinking now of David Mallett's book on foreign fighters and how he says that. Well, I mean, obviously, he's talking about the foreign fighters and mostly their involvement in the Middle East. But what he says, what he's found is that more than any other factor, what really truly has an impact on people is the extremist movement being able to frame their cause and sort of put it nested within some sort of a larger issue, and sort of to present their cause as, again, serving like this bigger, greater cause. So I think, I mean, your organization, having operated in mostly what is it, 20th, end of 20th, 21st century, is it? Have the idea that the organization had so many communication tools and the opportunity to really truly use every communication medium to sort of construct the narrative, and also to reach as wide an audience as NSM did, I think it was it's very, very, I mean, impressive in a way, I guess. But yeah, we also talked about, I think you mentioned very briefly the disengagement part of it. And in my research about you, I mean, some of the things that I came across was that in one article, I'm not sure if it's the New York Times one, I think you said that there was no grand epiphany that led you to the exit or to the work that you do now, and that it was rather the small things here and there. And I also think that in one of the articles, or at least somewhere, you must have said that for a couple of years before your disengagement, you already had this feeling of some sort of discomfort with the movement, and that you were not feeling necessarily as comfortable as what the movement was propagated as, before. So this to me is indicative that the process of disengagement, it can be slow and it can take years for people, although for some people it may also be you know very quick, very fast, and catalyzed by some sort of a, like a grand some sort of a grand epiphany. So I was wondering if you could talk us through a little bit, talk us through your disengagement process.
Sure, sure. And before I do that, I want to point out something else that you said. You had mentioned like ISIS and the radicalization process, and I wanted to mention a perfect example. That's a perfect example, because it's not just the far right, but it crosses into religious
Yeah.
extremism, far left extremism, all these sorts of things. And people wonder, and this goes back to the dehumanization thing. People wonder,
Yeah.
how can these guys in ISIS be chopping off heads and things like that? Is it because they're inherently evil? Maybe in some cases, yes. But the average person, I believe, that gets into that's doing that, they believe that they're doing God's work. They've fallen into this type of extremism, and
Hmm.
they're able to justify that in their head. They're able to say, I'm doing this for God, I'm doing this for Allah, I'm doing this for the cause. And that's the
Hmm.
same exact mentality. Now, maybe not chopping off heads as far as the far right
Hmm.
goes, but that's the same mentality that drives people in these other extremist groups. It's very cult-like if you break it down. I didn't like
Yeah.
that reference when I was in the movement, but processing those things and looking at it from the outside back looking in is definitely a very cult-like environment. But
Yeah,
now on to your
there's definitely some sort of a similarity. I've been trying to read up on the cult radicalization and then subsequent sort of cult disengagement. And there's definitely a lot that extremist movements and cults have in common in terms of their recruitment. And just a quick note on what you were saying just now, to anyone listening now, I think it would be a good point for me to tell you that if you're interested in what Jeff was just saying, a good reference point might be one of the talks that we did earlier. I'm not sure of what number it was, but it's about the formation of extremist ideologies, and sort of it walks you through the process of radicalization and the dehumanization or the othering part that Jeff just mentioned. That's very well explained by Dr. William Farrell of the University of Maine. So if anyone's interested in that, feel free to refer back to that. Back to you, Jeff.
So on my own, you asked about my own
Yes.
trajectory on why how I got out and all that. I didn't realize it at the time, but we always in the work we do at Beyond Barriers, we want people to disengage, and then disengagement first and then de-radicalization. For me, that process was backwards. It was the opposite. And I didn't
Mm.
know I was de-radicalizing, but looking back now and reanalyzing that time period, I was de-radicalizing while I was still in the organization and didn't realize it. And that's why I said it wasn't a grand epiphany, and it can be for some. I know we could get into that too, but I know different people that it was one thing. I know a guy that his car broke down on the side of the road. A
Mm.
black man stopped to help him. This guy's covered in swastika tattoos on his face and neck and hands, and not somebody that a lot of people would probably stop and help. And this guy stopped and helped him, repaired his car and all that. And after that, and this is when I was still in the movement. After that, the guy called me up and he says, "I'm done. I'm done. Um, this is what happened, and this isn't for me." And that was very interesting. For me, it was, excuse me. For me, it was meeting some different people. Part of it, it's a lot. It's a lot to explain, but part of it, a small part of it, was moving to Detroit. In Detroit, white people are the minority, so I'm dealing with different people of different races on a day-to-day basis, which I hadn't really done in my past
Yeah.
a whole lot. So having these connections and starting to see that that these people are really no different than me. You know, they're really they have the same desires, they have the same wants and needs for their families, they have the same interests. But that didn't fully, I wasn't ready to leave yet. I kept thinking um I was on the right path. You know, maybe I could change little things in the organization. Maybe I should, you know, it should be less radical. We started calling it a white civil rights organization. In
Yeah, I saw that.
2016, we went from the swastika to the odal rune for public perception, and that was what it was explained as at the time. But part of that was my own de-radicalization process that I wasn't aware that was happening at the time. But meeting and a couple of these individuals I can name because they are public figures. Daryl Davis, who works with us at Beyond Barriers. He's a Black musician. He played with Chuck Berry, Little Richard, all these famous musicians. Daryl's famous in his own right. He lights the piano keys on fire. He's an incredible musician. One
Really
of the
is.
team members at Beyond Barriers. Meeting him, sitting across from him, and this is what I want to explain. I'd met with reporters for years. As you know, NSM was a highly publicized organization. We didn't shy away from the media. We talked to them every chance we got because we saw that as an opportunity to propagate the message. So I went and met with Daryl. I thought, no big deal. I'll go meet with him. We'll, you know, have this opportunity to get the message out. What I didn't realize is that I would make a friend that has been with me to this day. But what it was that Daryl said that really got to me at that time, and this is why I talk about humanization, dehumanization, and rehumanization, and getting in touch with our humanity, because this is what Daryl did. I didn't even realize it at the time. But we're sitting across from each other, we're having the interview. Besides all the other commonalities that we had and interests that we had in common, what really got to me in his story was he was talking to me about when he was in the Boy Scouts as a child, like 8, 10 years old, somewhere around that age, very young. And he said he was in this Boy Scout parade and he was the only Black child that was there, and people were throwing rocks at him.
Yeah.
And he didn't understand at the time. He thought they just didn't like the Boy Scouts and that's why they were throwing rocks. And finally, you know, he gets home and his parents sit him down and they say, Daryl, it's not because they didn't like the Boy Scouts. They were throwing rocks at you because you were Black. And he says, no, I don't think so. He says, how can they hate me? They don't know me. And that's the question that he was on that mission to find the answer to, all still to this day. And
Yeah.
that hit me. But what went in my mind at that very time was, one of the things in the far right that is so often said is that we're doing this for our future generations, we're doing this for our children. And I was thinking about when he was telling the story about going home and telling his parents that, I was thinking about my own children and thinking, what if someone was throwing rocks at one of my kids? I don't think I should say the answer of how I would have reacted to that, but it would not have been pleasant for anybody that was doing something like that. And that bothered me deeply, that this ideology, it didn't all register right at that time, but it stuck with me. And piecing things together, trying to figure out things like, why did you do this? Because this is, all of us that disengage from this stuff go through that process after we leave. It's a lot of thinking, a lot of reflection. And that is one of the things, putting him showing his humanity and showing that vulnerability and sharing that story with me hit me hard. And I tried to put myself, I should say, in his shoes, or in his parents' shoes. And I thought about my own children on that. And I still didn't get out at that point, but that story resonated with me. And it was within 6 months, year max after that, I want to say maybe 6 months, somewhere in that time period, I met another filmmaker, Dia Khan, who made she's an Emmy award-winning filmmaker, made White Right Meeting the Enemy.
Yeah.
And I was one of the main characters or people that was in the film. And Dia got to me the way Dia put it. I would say for me, that was one of the final straws,
Mm.
because a similar story that she had told me, and I'd spent quite a bit of time with her because we were filming for, I want to say, weeks. So there was, I got to know her pretty well. Whereas with Daryl, it was a one-time meeting for an interview and then done. In this case, it was quite a bit of filming, and we got to know her. I got to know her quite well, I feel. And during that period of time, she had told me a similar story, and she's sitting across from me, and I could see the pain in her face. I could feel it, like an energy in the air, a vibe, or whatever you want to call it. I could feel it. I could feel it, and it hit me like a ton of bricks, or getting kicked in the chest by a horse. And some of that was on camera, and I'm still thinking like, oh, I've got to, say the right things for the movement. I've got to, be this person, and she's hitting me with this story,
Hmm.
about how hate made her feel like less than a person, how it made her feel ugly and hated. And here's this wonderful, amazing person sitting across from me, and I'm hearing this. That was the end for me. Now, I didn't leave immediately at that point, but out of the 3, 4, 5 people that I was talking to just before I left about it, because you can't tell anybody. Everybody is in the movement.
Yeah.
In that echo chamber, that bubble. So I was talking to Dia about it. I talked to my father about it, and a couple of local girls here that I know, and that was about it. That was about it. Maybe one other person, but it was, you couldn't tell anybody. Like if you asked the people in the movement, like when I did finally tell the people in the movement that I was leaving, that I told them I was retiring. Um, you can retire and not be considered the enemy, but when you speak out, you're the enemy. I knew I was going to speak out, but I wasn't ready for all the threats or whatever else, anger that would come from saying that. So for me, I retired at first in
Mm.
early March 2019. And then I started speaking out August, September of 2019. Started speaking out at that point. But Dia really got to me. And there was other people too. There was a Jewish lady that I had met here in the Detroit area, and just the other people along the route out there. But it was that reconnecting with that humanity, like being able
Yeah.
to see through those cracks in the barriers and go, wow.
Hmm.
That's part of the process. Is we need to see see the people that are involved in it as human beings. And if we can reconnect that humanity, that curious mind, or that that desire when they joined to do something noble and good. The
Mm.
reason I talk about that, I know some people don't understand it. And they're saying, why is he saying that they thought they were doing something noble? I'm saying this because this is what I do. We help bring people out of these movements. And if you look at them as evil, you don't see them as human beings, you're dehumanizing just like they do. Just like they do. And how I figured that out, it's kind of an interesting story. I was meeting with, I think it was a reporter from Chile or somewhere in South America. And I was talking about, and this was at the very end, like in the last year or so before I got out. And I was
Hmm.
talking about dehumanization. It's okay to laugh a little bit now, because here's a neo-Nazi talking about dehumanization. I didn't recognize the irony of this at the time, but I'm talking about the media dehumanizes us, other people dehumanize us, everybody's against us, because when you're in these movements, you feel like you're at war with the world, you're at war with everybody. And I'm talking about it, and the reporter's kind of looking at me like, just giving me this look like, what the heck? Nobody pointed it out. Like, here's a neo-Nazi talking about dehumanization. I was that person. This was an organization that dehumanized entire groups of people. Like, the irony completely missed me at the time. Like, I wasn't able to see it. And that's pretty awful, you know, like here's the irony of it. But the lesson to be learned in this is, by not by if we don't dehumanize the dehumanizer, if we can reconnect them with that curious mind, with that initial idea that got them into the movement, thinking they were going to do something good, showing them this isn't good, this is hurting people, this is hurting other families, this is hurting children, this is damaging, and reconnect them with that humanity, let them feel again. Because once you're in these movements, those barriers close around you, or that bubble or that echo chamber, it closes, and the feelings and emotions and stuff like that, I feel like, and a lot of other people have said this too, in the research that we're doing and things like that, a lot of people are saying it too, you couldn't show emotion. And some of the best examples I can give of that, even my own family, even my own kids had said, there was comments that were made later on after I got out. They're like, Dad has emotions. They would tell their mom, Dad has emotions. And at first I got angry about it. I was like, why are they saying that? Like, what, I didn't have emotions? Like, I'm not human? And, you know, first I got like defensive about it. But looking back, it was like, even in my home life, in my family life, I was just stoic all the time. Very, very, very detached. And that's I think one of the, not I think, I know that's one of the things that happens when you've become radicalized, is you lose touch with that. You don't think you have, because you'll say, no, that's not true. I fight for my family, I fight for my race, I fight for my nation, all these things, and you don't think it. But the reality of it is you have detached, you have lost track of that. And that goes in, and this is, I could talk about these things for hours, so feel free to interject at any point. I might be going on, but there was other things in that time period of getting out that I started to recognize, like in the organization. The organization wasn't a democracy, so there wasn't voting and all that. It was more like a dictatorship. So I'm making rules, and I'm thinking back, and it was like, okay, we had to put a social media policy in place. And the social media policy was to tell the members, you cannot post violent memes, you cannot post calls to violence, just like at demonstrations and things like that. None of us had ever gotten any arrests at demonstrations over all those years, because there was strict rules and regulations in this organization.
But that's also a bit of a defense mechanism, isn't it? To make sure that the movement can sort of carry on without any legal or sort of repercussions, so that these movements tend to sort of refrain from any, or at least they will have some sort of a rule that says that you can't really sort of put forth a call for violence, but that's not necessarily because you don't believe in violent acts, or, you know, violence being justified, but just because I don't want to then have to deal with the police for that.
Yes, exactly. So it's not coming from a moral place. It's not
Yeah.
coming from like, oh, let's not do that because it's our morals. It's let's not, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's exactly correct. Um, we didn't want people doing or saying those things because it could get us into legal trouble, or it could get us into problems. And it's not good for the public either. If we're trying to recruit from the public, and you've got some guy, and I didn't agree with some of the more violent stuff, especially that people were posting. Like, there was things on social media, and it's not just because of you know, you could get in trouble either, but it's for public perception as well.
Yeah, sure, 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 sure.
There was people posting things about burning mosques, and uh one individual posted like it must have been a picture from somewhere in Africa, from a genocide, with like chopped up body parts in a wagon, and things like that, and thought it was funny, like it was a joke or something. And it's like, why? And you start reflect I started reflecting on those things and going, what is wrong with this picture? Like, Why, if we're trying to say that we're a white civil rights organization and we're doing what we think are good things and trying to save our people, why would we be, even though it wasn't an official messaging or whatever, these are just individual members that were doing this, why are we attracting people that would think something like that's funny? Why
Mhm.
why do we have to have a policy to tell people that that's not okay? That's not normal. Like, I don't think these kind of things are normal. So that that started eating away at me. And then thinking about some of these other things over the years, and of course meeting Daryl and Dia and some of the other people I've met, like, this isn't this isn't something I want to be part of. I can't more. I kept thinking to myself, and I was saying this to Dia towards the end. I kept saying, "Oh, I feel like I have this responsibility. I have to stay here." And I kept making excuses. And a lot of people do this when they're getting out. My experience is a little more complicated because my business was rolled into this. My whole entire life was rolled into this. And when I said I was retiring, the
Mhm.
few people that I was still talking to in the movement at that time were saying things to me like, and it wasn't for them, it wasn't coming from a bad place. It was coming from a place like, Jeff, what are you going to do? The
Yeah.
whole world knows who you are and what you did in this. The Jews, because everything's the fault of the Jews in these, at least in the movement I was a part of, the Jews will hunt you down until the ends of time and hunt you down for what you've done. You will never be welcome back in society. You will never be seen as
Mhm.
anybody else but that Nazi leader, that poster boy for neo-Nazism. That's who you are. That's what they will see, forever. They're not going to forgive 27 years in this movement. And in the back of my mind, those were some of the things that I was struggling with when I was leaving. So hearing it from other people in the movement wasn't helpful at all, because those are some of the fears and concerns that people have when they're getting out, is that they won't be accepted back into society. And there's plenty of examples of that where to this day, and all former extremists have this. And it's not I want to explain that too, it's not the majority of people, but there is people out there to this day, even that know the work that I've been doing for the past 2 years, that will still call me a Nazi. It's
Mhm.
not very many, but there is still those people. And on one hand, you go, I understand why they might say that because of my past. And then on the other hand, it's hurtful because you're doing everything you can to repair the damage from the past. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of complications, a lot of avenues that this story can go. But those were some of the things that helped me to get out, was basically seeing the humanity of others and
Yeah.
reconnecting.
I mean, I think again, there's a lot that you said that is worth unpacking and going into further detail about. Is just I'm a proponent of the idea that all sort of, whether it be de-radicalizing or disengagement efforts, all kinds of communication with either you know not either but actual sort of extremists. I'm a proponent of the idea that all communication with people who are currently involved in extremist movements, it has to be based, and it has to be sort of founded on the attempt to reconnect them with the human, first and foremost within themselves, which I believe has to be a way that then helps them see the humanity in others. And then another thing which I think you mentioned, and then also this sort of the mantra that of Daryl Davis, which I think he still uses today, and this is sort of the underlying ideology of everything he does, is that how can you hate me if you don't know me? And I think as human beings, it is, we do often hate those that we don't know. And I always say that differences between human beings exist. It's differences exist on individual levels, but also on group levels. But the differences that exist, they have to be used as the basis for intercultural or intergroup dialogue. And it has to serve as as the grounds for curiosity to know more about one another and how it is that we're building this world and this life together, not as the basis for hatred. But again, I mean, human beings tend to hate what they don't know. This brings me to my next question. What do you think, now that you've sort of lived one life in an extremist movement, and now you've disengaged completely and you're doing the exact opposite of what you spent half of your life doing? Now that you've seen both sides of it, and now that you're basically the founder of the organization that tries to help people out of those movements, what are some of your maybe general recommendations to countries that are experiencing these problems with the rising sort of threats of far right extremism? Do you have any advice what could be, or maybe what should be done on either national or community levels? And my next question will then be about the individual communication with people who are involved in extremist movements.
I think it's incredibly important that governments around the world, here in the US, in Georgia, and all other countries that are experiencing issues with extremism, it doesn't have to be just far right, it could be far left, it could be religious extremism, extremism in general, any kind of extremism. I think they need to be working with former extremists, because we have a unique understanding of that process, of how people think that are in those movements, why they think it. And there needs to be a better, a lot of what we're doing it with nothing. I mean, we've put our own finances into this, and most of the team, everybody's just volunteering and doing the work. We could do so much more if we had the funding, whether it was from the government, whether it was from foundations or private sector. But part of the issue with the funding is a lot of the people in the private sector look at an organization like this and go, this is a government problem. The government should be backing you guys. The government should be funding this stuff. And I don't think that you can put a price tag on the importance of this work, because when we look at it and you break it down, and this goes back to, I was criticized by somebody once, and they said something like, you know what, Jeff Schoep is just doing this work to save some of his old Nazi buddies. That's why he's doing it. And I thought, man, what a stupid thing to say, But again, from the outside looking in, they don't get that. My thought on that is, if we can off-ramp the next terrorist, or the next, and I don't want to name these guys, but like the next Oklahoma City bomber, how about that?
Yeah.
Or the next synagogue shooter, the next mosque shooter, if we can off-ramp that individual, and chances are maybe we have off-ramped somebody like that. If we can off-ramp them, how many innocent lives have we saved? How many lives were affected, like in Christchurch, by all those in New Zealand, all those families that were killed and murdered there? How that affects that entire line of people, every relative, every friend, every family member, how that affects them. So off-ramping the Nazi or the extremist that was going to go do something, that's just a bonus point. That's just an great, that guy or lady is out. But all those innocent lives, how can you put a price tag on that? It is absolutely incredibly important. Here in the United States, the government is talking about it all day long. It's on the news. They're talking about extremism this, extremism that, but we need to stop talking about it, and we need to fund these efforts. The government needs to fund these efforts, and that needs to be done around the world, and we need to take it seriously, and it needs to be done right. I've seen the wrong way that it's being done over and over again is to approach these groups or approach people in it and tell them that they're wrong. You know they're wrong. I know they're wrong. Half the world knows they're wrong. They don't know they're wrong. If you come and approach them, it's the same way when people approached me for years. Why are you doing this, Jeff? This is crap. Why do you believe in this garbage, this racist crap? When you're in it, you don't see it as racist crap. You see it as, hey, I'm going to save the world. And every person that does that to you, you just push back more. Every time I got pressured to get out, or someone doxed me, or someone physically attacked me, every time I got physically attacked, I doubled down on everything I was doing.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, you think you're gonna intimidate me? Watch this 10 times more. And that's typical. Then now and people will say, well, there's a case of a guy that was doxxed. I can think of about 3 people I know of that were doxxed and then they left.
Mm.
It does happen, but those are not people that are ideologically committed, and those are people that are on the fringes, that are sort of weak in their thought process, that are not totally radicalized, and maybe just in it for fun or friends or things like that. To an ideologue, if you pressure them, you're going to get hit back. You're going to get pressured back. So this concept of tackling extremism in different nations, it has to be done right. We use storying, explaining, like what Daryl and Dia did
Mm-hmm.
with me. That's one of the same processes that we use at Beyond Barriers, is to reconnect with that humanity. And I know I keep hammering on that, but that's it. That is it. And it's not going to work 100% of the time. There is people that will always push back. We can't reach everybody, but we could make a huge impact and a huge dent in this. If someone like me that was in 27 years can walk away, anybody can do it. There's people that we're working with now that were in even longer than I was, that were in since the 80s, that have come out and changed. So it is possible. We have to, in my opinion, the governments need to fund these projects, and they need to talk with the people that have experience. They need to talk with people that know what they're talking about. And that I think those of us that were in a long time, and especially like in the position that I was in, and I don't say this to brag or anything like that, because there's nothing to brag about having been involved in this stuff that long. In fact, it's really actually quite shameful. And I've beat myself up enough over why did I stay so long? Why didn't I see this before? We don't have to talk about that, but focusing on those, on reconnecting them with that humanity, that mission where they thought they were going to do something good and get involved in this stuff. I think if the governments can back that, we can take such a bigger dent out of this, and an impact. And really what that boils down to is saving lives. You can't put a price tag on human life. You can't.
Yeah, a point to what you were just saying is that I personally firmly believe that with whatever the problem that we might be thinking of, you cannot deal with a problem, address the problem, if you don't understand the problem. So I do think that there's value in trying to understand where people who engage in extremist behaviors and violent behaviors, where is it that they're coming from? And there's a person that that I have tremendous respect for. I will actually name the person. It's Dr. Edward Denmark, the former chief of police of Harvard, Massachusetts, actually, who I think is an outstanding human being, and he's helped me a lot. He's done a lot of work with GCSD and with me about the violent extremism and everything. And something that he has told me time and time again is it is important to understand where these people are coming from, because not everyone is necessarily a bad person, but often at the heart of hatred and at the heart of violent behavior lies fear and people acting out based on that fear. And then what's important is to be able to understand sort of the motivation and where people may be coming from without condoning it. So you need to analyze something with it without condoning it, is basically what I think I'm trying to say here. I do have to be mindful of the time. I may have lost track of time a little bit, because if at some point it just felt like a conversation between the two of us, and I thank you for that. But this would be a good time to ask my team to send me the audience questions if we have any. If the audience has any questions, this would be a good time to ask those questions. If people have already been asking questions, I'm going to ask my team to send me those questions. But in the meantime, let me just go back to a couple of things that you said. One thing that I wanted to mention, you mentioned Daryl Davis and Dia Khan, and I know that you explained a little bit who they are. But Daryl Davis is this extraordinary human being who he hasn't been just a part of Jeff's disengagement and this de-radicalization, but he has in fact not just contributed to, but he is, I think, singularly personally responsible for the disengagement and de-radicalization of hundreds at this point of extremists, of hundreds of KKK members. So I would encourage everyone to learn more about this person, because he does carry a message of unity, of mutual understanding, and he does, I think, you put his skills to the best use possible. And then also you mentioned Dia Khan and her documentary Meeting the Enemy. I think that's an outstanding documentary, and I would encourage everyone to watch it. So good. Okay, so there's a question. Let me put my reading glasses on because my eyes are terrible. Right. Here's the question. In the Beyond Barriers, where do you start disengagement process from? How do you reach out to individuals? Okay, this is a loaded question. There's a lot of questions packed into one. But first, where do you start the disengagement process from? How do you reach out to the individuals? And is there any sort of approach you use that encourages individuals to question their current extremist ideology and sort of step on the path of rethinking that you've just described?
That's like three or four questions in one.
I know, right? Someone was very smart with a question. They've loaded it with several sub questions. But it is a valid question, to be honest, because yeah, a lot of the time, especially in the disengagement work, the principle will be that it has to be voluntary. So they have to reach out to you. I think that's been the practice with returnees from conflict zones in the Middle East. So I do think it's important to see how to hear you tell us about how Beyond Barriers does that.
Yes, and just before that too, you touched on fear. That was actually on my list of things to mention. I hadn't gotten to it yet. Fear is a much more stronger emotion than hate, and I'll just keep it short on that. But fear is one of the largest motivating factors of why people get involved in this, because they no one will admit it that's in. If I know Dia had said it to me when I was in, like, Jeff, this sounds like a lot of fear that you're talking about, like the white race is going to be genocided and all this kind of stuff. They don't recognize that, because the whole thing is we're not afraid of anything. But really, when you boil it down, that's what it is. It's fear. It's motivated by fear. But to answer the viewer question, there's a lot of different processes with it. We don't do a lot of reaching out to people that are in like cold calling, or however you want to explain that, but like going and reaching out to them and saying, hey, come and listen to us. We don't do a lot of that, but we do counter messaging videos and things like that, because one thing that we know, and this is something a lot of people in the movement watch what we're saying. They watch the videos, they watch what we're putting out, even if they make nasty comments or thumbs down it on YouTube or
Yeah.
things like that, they're still watching. So we have those opportunities to engage. And a lot of people, what I noticed before I founded I founded Beyond Barriers, I had set up jeffschoep.com, just my personal website, to kind of showcase the things that I was doing and the work that I was doing. And so many people were reaching out and asking questions, just random questions like, oh, so you're a communist now? Oh, so you're Antifa now? Or so when you leave the movement, you have to become a communist? And at first I was like, my gosh, of all the things you're going to accuse me of, a communist, my gosh, it made me kind of angry at first, but I had to bring myself back to that moment of how I thought when I was still in there. And because it's so extreme and the environment is so polarizing, you believe literally that everybody that's outside of your bubble or your circle is the enemy. And that's easy to label: communist, Antifa, whatever you want to call it. So at that point, instead of getting angry, I engaged with these people. I said, what makes you think I'm a communist? I'm not a communist. Why do you say that? And it brings up that opportunity to talk. I've even had people that have reached out and they'll act like they think I'm still in the movement. They'll say, "Oh, Commander, I reached out," and darn well they know that I'm out because they contacted me through the website, But they're just saying these things, and I said, Why do you think I'm still in the movement?" And they're like, "Oh, we knew, or I knew you weren't, but I didn't know how to start the conversation." So they're nervous to connect as well.
Hmm.
So whatever it takes to get them in that door, to answer the question, whatever it takes to get them in the door, whatever kind of engagement, unless they're saying, "Hey, I'm going to kill you" or something, then there's no
Hmm.
reason to respond. But if it's just something smart or nasty, engage, because quite often we're finding with the work we do at Beyond Barriers, even you get off of a phone call or you get off of a conversation, they're saying things like, "I can't believe that even though we don't agree politically on things, that we had this positive dialogue. We had this respectful conversation." Respect is a big part of it too. And this goes back to what I was saying a little bit ago. If you approach somebody and you call them scum or say everything they believe in is trash, they're not going to listen to you. You have to, and this is why Daryl Davis, and I'm glad you pointed that out because he is phenomenal. And that approach that Daryl uses, that Dia Khan uses, that is very similar to what we are utilizing. Daryl's a member of our team. If anybody wants
Hmm.
more information on him, he's on our website. You can contact him through there. Um, and that's part of it, is establishing that dialogue and being respectful. So if for those at home or those that are interested in doing this type of thing, just a little bit even on their own, just to reach out, listen, even though, and this Dia's explained this, I heard her explain this on a podcast too, even though you might be listening to some of the most vicious, hateful, disgusting stuff that you totally agree with, respect is a big part of how the trajectory of how these people think. So if you've taken the time to listen to what they have to say, now they have to listen to
To
what you
listen
have
to
to say.
you. Yeah.
So that's where you can insert those things, and storying is a good way of doing it. Sharing experiences that you've had, or how hate has damaged you or your family or someone it's
Hmm.
a very real thing. It's why, with like in the Holocaust, if you have a Holocaust survivor that comes in and talks to your class or talks to school, that is going to hit them harder than any sort of reading from a book or things like that, because it's
Okay.
very real, it's very in your face, and that's how it works. That's the most effective way that we can reach other people.
I have two
I'm not
more
sure if I
questions for
missed
you.
part of those questions either, Mariam, but I think that was it.
We have two more questions. After that, I promise I won't keep you for much longer. I won't abuse of your time.
It's
I'm very
okay.
grateful for your generosity, by the way. So, who would be the best person in the position to help with de-radicalization? Is it family members, clergy, psychologists, neighbors, media, government employers, etc.?
That's a good
This is
question.
difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, because all of the above, yes, but the best people, I think, and I don't want to, just say, "Oh, keep answering formers, people that have been there." But it's like if you go to Alcoholics Anonymous meeting
Yeah.
and there's someone that's up there that's talking about stuff that hasn't been an alcoholic, it doesn't, even if they've studied it and they understand it and it resonates, it's not quite the same as someone that's actually been there. So formers a lot of times, and not formers alone, but formers in connection with academics, with mental health professionals, with all of these things, whether it's your minister, your priest, those things help too. So I want
Yeah.
to say all of the above. Everybody can play a part in this, even though I believe that formers really are the first line, I think, in this fight.
Mm.
All of those people can have a place, and especially if it's someone in your family and things like that, don't approach them in an aggressive, confrontational manner. Use
Mm.
kindness, use understanding, use listening, and as hard as it can be sometimes, patience. It doesn't
Yeah.
always happen overnight. You gotta stick with it and be uh, supportive.
I fully agree with what you just said. I believe that it's all about engaging the multitude of of different actors and stakeholders who may have an impact on a particular situation. But also, to add to what you were saying, it truly depends on the individual case. And I think the case by case approach would be the best way forward in case of in sort of in terms of de-radicalizing individuals. And anyone embarking on the mission of sort of either designing or delivering de-radicalization programs would have to understand that the responsibility is to really look at each case individually, and then hopefully engage the actors that would have the most influence over the individual and over the particular situation. One more question about counter narratives. Do they work? Have you been able to measure that? While you can avoid certain issues, you can still deal with them through less confronting ways with alternative narratives instead. I'm not sure that I read the question correctly, but I suppose the question is basically about whether or not counter narratives work. Have you been able to measure that? And then I believe it has to do something about the difference between alternative narratives and counter narratives, and how counter narratives, I suppose, they attack the narrative of the extremist organization directly, whereas the alternative narratives sort of offer you the alternative. Well, maybe there's a different way. So what do you have to say about that?
I mean, it's a good question in the sense of it's something I would almost like to pitch to our research department, because we do question how people are getting out and what's worked. And I don't know, I would have to defer that to the research department as something that, if we're not asking it, that we should be asking if those the counter narrative videos are kind of a newer thing that is being experimented with. So that would be something to definitely look at. A lot of them kind of are scary in a sense, like this is what can happen to you. One of the very first cases that I was working on when I started doing this work was pretty interesting, because the young man, I started off by telling him about, he knew my story because he knew who I was. And I said, look, I know countless people that have died, that have lost their lives, that have went to prison, lost all these people and all these families that were damaged. And I said, it's a miracle that I made it this far, that I was able to get past that. And that's one of the reasons why I want to give back and do the work that I do now. I said, young man, the whole point of my speech to this guy, or my pitch was, you might not make it this long, and his answer was, well, Jeff, I might just do what you did. I'll stay in the movement, and 20 something years from now, then I'll retire and I'll just leave then. I said, you missed my whole point. It's incredible that I was able to survive and get through all this stuff. I said, you might not make it. You probably won't make it. The odds are not in your favor. That's not the point I was trying to get across. And his response to that was, he goes, because I said, let's not even unbox the ideology. Let's just talk about you on a human level. And he says, okay, ideology, or he goes, I want to bring back the ideology for a moment. I said, sure. What do you got to say? And he says, if the ideology is correct, let's just pretend or whatever. I know you don't think it's correct, but let's just say the ideology is correct. He says, my life means nothing. The cause means everything. So if I sacrifice my life for the cause, then it's okay. And like the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was like, oh my gosh, this is like looking in a mirror at myself at that age. Yeah. And I told another individual that I work with that was also in the NSM years ago. I started telling him that story. And before I could finish, he says, brother, that's us. That was us at that age. That's exactly what we would have said. And I was like, oh gosh, that's exactly what I was thinking. So when you look at it from that perspective, if they're that radicalized that they believe that, telling them they're wrong isn't going to help. But or scaring them out of it isn't going to help. So there's different approaches, and I think showing them those alternative ways or alternative viewpoints is something that we're doing a lot of
Yeah.
now, because there's people that are reaching out, even that are really here in the United States. The Democrats and Republicans are so divided.
Yeah.
So people are saying, hey, I'm feeling like I'm slipping more to the far right. These are just regular people that are reaching out to us that are not in extremist organizations. How can I process this? How can I do better to not do that? So we're doing a lot of talks now about staying centered, staying in the center. Like, you don't, in extremist ideology, you feel like you have to be on one extreme or the other, and you can't see what's in between. I said, listen, most of the world, most of us are here in the center. You don't have to be far left. You don't have to be far
Or
right.
far right.
Be here.
Yeah.
You can be moderate right, moderate left, or anywhere in the middle. And it's just like, it's almost like a light bulb goes off, or sometimes they'll argue it and they'll say, no, the whole left is getting radical, so I have to get radical and go to the right. So it's tough, because the media, I feel like, in some ways, is feeding some of those narratives and making everything very, the lifting up the extremist narratives. So we have to find that balance and show people that there's middle ground. I think that's the best way to summarize it.
Definitely. Although counter narratives have a merit of their own, and I think that technique is very often used, especially with, at least from what I've read and what I've learned, is that it's very often used with Islamist, former extremists, especially I think in the prison settings where people there are designated people who go in and provide counter narratives that specifically address what's been what these people have been told, and how religious values and norms have been manipulated to sort of build this extremist narrative. So that's when sometimes organizations will have an individual, some sort of a professional, who then goes in and employs the specific counter narrative that does precisely that. It dismantles the extremist narratives. It shows the everything that is wrong, everything that was incorrect in the extremist narrative. So it definitely has its value, but also, of course, the alternative narratives have their value as well. Now, I have abused of your time enough. And as my last question, and I promise to let you go after that, as my last question, I always ask our speakers to recommend some readings for our audience, also for me. So if you have any recommendations, please share them with us.
Well, I'd like to recommend a film, and I'll tell you why.
Sure.
First, it's called Hope in the Holy Land. It's brand new. It just came out, I endorse this film. I'm on their webpage and all that, but it's under the endorsements. But I really enjoyed this film because it covers all of the aspects of the really complex situation over there in Israel and Palestine, and the between. It covers all sides. It covers why they think, why the extreme people on each side of that, and all of the different, even the minority groups, the Christians, where they're stuck in this scenario, and the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, and then they go from moderate to extreme on each level. So I highly recommend that. It was so interesting to me, as far as and a very humanistic approach to it. Like, they were talking about, well, at the end there was like, here's Israelis and Palestinians working together in this community and building businesses. So that was really awesome. I think it picked apart those complexities, and left you going, wow, now I really understand why it's so difficult to obtain peace over there. So I think that's a good one for anybody that's doing this kind of work, or trying to understand it, so you can kind of break down those complexities. That's a good one. As far as books go, and I haven't finished this one, but it's been highly recommended by a lot of people. The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal. Um, as I said, I haven't finished it. I feel like I have no free time these days because I'm doing this stuff all the time. But I did manage to watch that movie, and I think it's really good. And I've heard that the Sunflower is highly recommended. And of course, we work closely with the Simon Wiesenthal Center as well. So um, I'll plug in for them.
Good. If anyone in the world can get hold of Daryl Davis's book, that's been incredibly difficult to get, I would highly recommend it. If not, I think his second book is due to be out very soon.
Yep.
Fingers crossed. So when that's out, I know that I will let everyone know as part of one of our TRC talks. Well, okay. Again, I think I've kept you long enough. I've kept the audience long enough. Thank you, Jeff, for being with us. I think this was very informative. I think there's tremendous value in talking to and listening to the formers and learning from your experience. Thank you for being so open about your process of engagement, but also the disengagement, and for the advice that you've shared with us. Thank you for your time and the effort. It's been a pleasure to get to know you personally now, because I've attended countless of your talks, and I think I tried to read everything that your organization either puts out or you share on social media. So it's been a pleasure to meet you, and I hope to have you back on TRC talks sometime in the future.
I'd love to. Thank you. It's been an incredible honor, and keep up the amazing work you're doing over there in Georgia, Mariam.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you to the audience, depending on where you were joining us from. Good morning, good evening, good night. Have an amazing rest of the day. Have a lovely rest of the day, depending on anywhere you are. I hope you come back to watch the next TRC talk, which we will be announcing shortly. Thank you to my team. Thank you to Nico for helping us with the technical stuff. Thank you to everyone that's been a part of this. And yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.